It's interesting reading the comments on this Dylan White video, which I posted to my YouTube channel, where he's clapping back at Andy Ruiz and calling him every name under the sun. People in general are cheering Dylan on. They're saying things like, Andy Ruiz doesn't know who he's messing with. This isn't Anthony Joshua. This is Dylan White. He don't play. Other people are expressing their frustration at the fact that Anthony Joshua doesn't talk like this and doesn't respond to his rivals the way that Dylan does. They wish that he did. Well, I like these kind of videos from Dylan White, from people like Jarrell Miller, Tyson Fury, from an entertainment perspective. I find it funny. I like it. But I don't buy in to this kind of trash talk being significant in the sense that it means a fighter is more real, more serious, more dangerous than another. Let me explain. When I was growing up in Brixton in South London in the 1990s as a teenager, there was a belief among the general public, as well as the boxing fraternity to some extent, that in order to be the best fighter in the world, you had to be from the streets. You had to be a bad boy. You probably even had to have a criminal history. Because if you were some guy from the suburbs, a choir boy, a church boy or something, a mama's boy, that wasn't going to cut it at the elite level in boxing. You wouldn't be tough enough. You had to be from the streets. You had to be a bad boy. This was the prevailing belief. And so Brixton back then was a very, very rough environment. Not like it is today with all the gentrification. Back then, it was the epicenter of the crack epidemic in London in the 1990s. There was a lot of violence, a lot of murders, shootings, stabbings, all kinds of crazy stuff going on. And in my circle, when I was a teenager, most people had been involved in crime to some degree or another. It was the norm for us back then. And so as young, ignorant street kids, we looked up to the bad boys in our neighborhood. When I say bad boys, I'm talking about gangsters. We looked up to them. But not only did we look up to bad boys in our neighborhood, we also looked up to bad boys in music, like in hip hop, and we looked up to bad boys in boxing. Now, the epitome of a boxing bad boy was, of course, Mike Tyson, and he was one of our idols growing up. Mike Tyson was the personification, at least in our minds, of what a tough guy was all about. In order to be tough, you had to have an intimidating appearance. You had to be full of intimidating talk, very vulgar, very aggressive, very impulsive. All the things that Mike Tyson exuded. Okay? Somebody who didn't have that kind of aura and persona was viewed as maybe a bit weak, a bit wishy-washy. Now, I was boxing as a teenager in the 90s and obviously involved in the social scene and whatnot. And one of the things I came to discover is that a lot of these bad boys who we looked up to couldn't actually fight. I saw many incidents growing up where some of these bad boys would get into fights and the person they were fighting wouldn't really try and fight back because they were intimidated by the bad boy's reputation. They thought, if I fight back, I could end up getting beaten up by a bunch of people or worse, getting stabbed, getting shot, getting kidnapped, getting robbed, God knows what. So a lot of them just wouldn't even put up much of a fight. They just hold a beating and live to see another day. And so these bad boys were going around with a full sense of their own prowess as fighters, some of them. They genuinely believe that they are real tough with their hands. And some of them took it into boxing gyms. I ain't going to name no names, but if you're from Brixton and you're above a certain age and you were involved in boxing, you know at least one or two of these bad boys, and they were really about that life on the roads. They tried to step into a boxing gym And of course, people in boxing gyms, a lot of them don't know who these bad boys are. They're not necessarily all from Brixton or involved in the street scene. They don't know who some of these guys are. And these bad boys step in the ring to spar and they get ironed out. I saw that on several occasions growing up. And it was an eye-opener to me because even though I was involved in boxing myself, I was still immature. I was still impressed by some of these bad boys on the roads and stuff like that. I was still caught up in that mentality to some extent. And so it was a bit of an eye-opener to me when I saw certain guys get ironed out in the gym. And even in street fights where bad boys from our neighborhood would go maybe to a different part of London, East London or wherever, get involved in a fight with someone who didn't know who they were, and they get ironed out. Now, of course, there were certain people in my environment who really could fight. They were bad boys and they were nice with their fists, and some of them were even boxers. But the majority of those bad boys, they were not boxers. They were guys who used weapons and intimidation and, outnumbering people. But one-on-one, they weren't really about it. But they had the reputation that they could actually fight because many of the people who they beat up were just scared to fight back. Now, how this relates to boxing is you've got the general public, again, who buy into this idea that these people from the streets are going to be tougher. These bad boys with criminal backgrounds are going to be better fighters. There's that element of it in boxing. But there's also the element that certain bad boy fighters, from a street environment, street background, been to prison maybe, they also buy into their own hype. They also buy into their own aura and believe that because I'm from the streets and this guy's not, he can't beat me. And sometimes they rely on that. The ultimate example of it would be Evander Holyfield. Now, Holyfield grew up in the Deep South in Alabama. I know during his boxing career, he was billed as being from Atlanta, Georgia, but he was originally from Alabama. He grew up very poor in a big family, but he wasn't a bad boy. He wasn't in the streets. He wasn't getting arrested and going to prison like Mike Tyson or anything like that. Holyfield was a good boy, a church boy, and a mama's boy. And so when he was coming up in the amateur game, there were certain fighters, like Ricky Womack, you'll see in this fight. Ricky Womack was one of those bad boys from the roads, from the streets, who intimidated a lot of people. I mean, Manny Stewart talked about Ricky Womack and described him as one of those bully type guys. And Holyfield always felt an urge to bring those street guys, those street dudes down a peg or two. It always seemed to be a thing about these street type guys that annoyed Holyfield, and he wanted to prove a point by going up against one of those guys and beating him. And that's what he did against Ricky Womack. It was actually an upset at the time, Holyfield beating Ricky Womack, because Womack, again, wasn't just a very good boxer, but he had this intimidating aura, this street guy persona, which intimidated a lot of his opponents. And a lot of the general public bought into this. Fast forward to Evander Holyfield's professional career, and you've got him going up against Mike Tyson, who was like Ricky Womack times 10 in terms of his street persona and aura of intimidation. Mike Tyson had just come out of prison not too long ago. He'd been in there with the killers. He had killers around him. There was a guy called Crocodile who was part of Mike Tyson's team. He was a killer. He was out there with Tupac and Suge Knight and all these other people. So he was the personification of the bad boy. And here he is going up against Evander Holyfield, the church boy, the mama's boy. The guy who probably barely even got a parking ticket. A tough fighter, yes. He'd been in there against Riddick Bowe, George Foreman, Larry Holmes, Michael Moorer, etc., etc. But he wasn't the Iron Man from the streets, from the Brownsville ghetto, who'd been putting in work from when he was like 12 years old, going to prison, arrested dozens of times. Like, Holyfield wasn't that guy. And again, we believed at the time, we bought into the Mike Tyson street dude aura. We thought it meant something in the ring. But what we came to discover about Mike Tyson is the same thing I came to discover about a lot of the bad boys in my neighborhood. I mean, Mike Tyson could fight, but Mike Tyson relied, the same way though the bad boys in the neighborhood, he relied too much on the intimidation factor. And if the opponent wasn't intimidated and they didn't buy into the perceived idea that the street guy is necessarily going to be tougher than the church guy, then the street guy's got a real fight on his hands. And he's in a situation he's not used to. He's used to throwing punches and the other guy's too intimidated to really fight back with any venom. What happens when someone's not too intimidated? What happens when someone's not in awe of that street criminal background? Well, what happens is what happened right here. Mike Tyson got a good old-fashioned butt kicking in this fight. Mike Tyson actually tried to quit at one stage in this fight. Freddie Pacheco pointed it out. Mike Tyson actually headbutts Holyfield in this fight. People talk about Holyfield headbutting. Holyfield didn't headbutt Mike Tyson in this fight or in the second fight either. He keeps his head down. Of course you do. On the inside against Mike Tyson. What are you going to do? Keep your head in the air? You're going to keep your chin glued to your chest. A headbutt is when you literally shove your head forward into somebody's face. Holyfield doesn't do that in any of the Tyson fights. Tyson does it to Holyfield though. And Freddie Pacheco doesn't call it out as a headbutt, although he should. But what he does say is Tyson's trying to quit. You see, because it was incredibly embarrassing for Mike Tyson to be getting beaten up by Holyfield. Because again, Tyson had all these killers around him and these street guys around him and this bad boy persona where he's coming into the ring with this screw face, really believing in his own hype. Then the fight starts and he starts getting hit by this church boy and the church boy is not intimidated and now the church boy is beating him up. Imagine how embarrassing that is for a bad boy like Mike Tyson from the streets to be getting battered by a church boy. And in the second fight, we really saw the manifestation of that. Of him literally quitting because he was going to get another beating from the church boy. And so what Mike Tyson did is he bit Holyfield to try and get himself out of the fight, but also to try and appeal to the other bad boys out there, or not necessarily just the bad boys out there, but the people who buy in to this street mentality and they're impressed by the street mentality. You know, I remember reading an interview with Rakim, the famous hip hop MC, the rapper, you know, widely regarded as one of the greatest rappers of all time. And Rakim said that he was extremely disappointed with Holyfield in this fight. He said that Holyfield behaved like a bitch. That is what I'm talking about when it comes to the street mentality. So here we have Mike Tyson basically trying to quit in the fight by fouling his way out, not dealing with it with his fist, but instead trying to take it to the streets and bite and do all this kind of dirty fighting. He also tried to break Holyfield's arm in one of the clinches in one of the preceding rounds. I think it was in the second round. Rather than saying, hang on, this guy lost his bottle, got scared because he was going to get another beating and fouled his way out of the fight, because that's what happened. Instead of saying that, he's attacking Holyfield. Again, because people buy into this whole street thing. They think it means something in the ring. It don't mean anything in the ring. It only means something if the opponent buys into it. That's a lesson that the general public need to learn and understand. Okay? So, coming back to where I started with this Dylan White video. Now, Dylan White comes from Jamaica. He came to the UK when he was 12. Jamaica's a third world country, very tough. In the UK, obviously, he grew up in Brixton from the age of 12. And, you know, Brixton, when he came to the UK, wasn't quite as bad as it was when, you know, I was growing up in the 90s. But, you know, still, Dylan definitely went through some sticky situations in Brixton, no doubt about it. So Dylan's from the streets. And he's really a tough guy. I'm not here to tell you Dylan ain't tough. Dylan's a real tough guy. But when he fought Anthony Joshua, Joshua's not from the streets. Joshua's from Watford. And I know he was involved in some little shenanigans here and there, which he ended up, getting convicted for. But Watford is like Disneyland, okay, compared to the Brixton that Dylan White grew up in, or certainly the Brixton I grew up in. It's like Disneyland. So Anthony Joshua is not really a bad boy. He's not really a street guy. None of that. But when he got in the ring against Dylan White, it didn't matter. Do you understand? Because Anthony Joshua didn't buy into all that street stuff. When Dylan White was in the Klitschko camp, he wanted to take Anthony Joshua outside for a straightener. Anthony Joshua didn't want to go outside. Before they even fought each other, I think it was earlier that same year, Dylan White was on social media telling Anthony Joshua to come meet him on the roads and sort it out face to face. Anthony Joshua didn't want to come and meet him. Okay, so Anthony Joshua is not about that street life. Dylan White, I don't want to say he's about it right now, but he's still got that kind of mentality in him to some extent. But when they fought each other, it didn't matter because Anthony Joshua didn't buy into that. When you get in a boxing ring, you can't bring your crew with you. You can't bring weapons with you. Do you understand? It's just you by yourself with boxing gloves on. So that's the moral of the story. And particularly when it comes to Anthony Joshua, it's still something which people don't get. They think that because he's this politically correct guy and he doesn't really talk a lot of trash and doesn't talk in this aggressive and vulgar way, that it somehow means he's weak. You do realize that Holyfield was similar to Anthony Joshua. I mean, he wasn't as much of a media darling as Joshua is, but Holyfield was never a guy to be talking loads of smack and swearing and trying to intimidate. But Holyfield was never like that. He was this real quiet, humble guy, always talking about God and Jesus. That's how Holyfield was. I mean, even in more recent times, you've had Gennady Golovkin. He gets up in the ring after the fight talking about good boy and smiling and all this kind of business. But yet, when the bell goes, nobody's smiling. So people shouldn't buy so much in to these street personas. Yes, it's entertaining and funny when you see Jarrell Miller in particular. Jarrell Miller is one of my favorite for the smack talk because I just find him hilarious. Even though the guy's, his morals are in the toilet, Jarrell Miller, let's be real. But from an entertainment perspective, he's funny, he's entertaining. Dylan White, great, hilarious stuff that Dylan White says. Very entertaining interview. Probably the most entertaining interview in boxing is Dylan White, for my money. I always tune in to watch a Dylan White interview, always entertaining. And even when he gets aggressive and starts going into bad boy mode. But I take it for what it is. It's entertainment. It doesn't mean that the most aggressive guy in interviews is going to get in the ring and just destroy everybody. It doesn't work like that. And in fact, if he believes it works like that, it can backfire on him. As it did to Mike Tyson, as it did to many bad boys that grew up in the environment I grew up in. So anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Hopefully I got my point across. Don't worry about somebody talking trash. Worry about what they do in the ring. That's where it matters. As I say, the majority of people, because most people who watch boxing are casuals. And I'm talking about most people who watch the big fights. The Joshua fights, the Wilder fights, they're mostly casuals. And casuals still are under the impression that the guy who talks the toughest, the guy who gives off the most confident persona, the guy who acts like he's from the streets is going to be the guy who's the best. People don't even care that much about resume these days. They'll find some way to spin it in their mind and say that actually the guy with the best resume doesn't have a good resume, and this other guy who talks tough, his resume is the best. It's incredible. I mean, you look at Deontay Wilder, talking about he's a killer and this, that, and the other. Deontay Wilder gives off this, bad boy persona. But if you've watched some of those Wilder documentaries, you'll know that before boxing, he was working as a waiter, as a busboy. So he's not even about that life himself. But just because he gives off that aura, that persona, people are impressed by it. I'm not impressed. In fact, Dylan White's not impressed, all right? To go back to people who can see through the persona of others. Dylan White talked about how he's not intimidated at all by Deontay Wilder's act. He says Deontay's not really a street dude. He's some church boy from Alabama who used to work in McDonald's. All right? But even if he was a street dude, you still shouldn't be intimidated. But you can't bring the streets with you into the ring. You can only bring your 2 fists. Yeah? There's a lesson there for everybody. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comment section below. It's happening, I'm out. Join me on Patreon. I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts every single week, covering a wide variety of controversial topics, as well as live stream Q&A sessions. Take a look on screen right now at some of the podcasts I've produced so far. For just $3 a month, the equivalent of about £2 a month, you get access to all my new podcasts and my entire back catalogue of past podcasts, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the Patreon app from the Google Play Store or the App Store for free. The Patreon app also allows you to download each podcast in MP3. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you get access to dozens of hours of exclusive content. It's easy to sign up, there's no contract, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.